Hello, welcome to BBC Learning Zone on BBC Two. And in the early hours this morning, we've programmes for schools. GCSE Bitesize English, in fact, this morning, and a programme focusing on the skills you'll need for part of Paper 2 of your English exam on poetry.
Hello and welcome to GCSE Bitesize. The aim of this programme is to help you get a higher grade for your poetry answers in Paper 2 GCSE English. You can use this programme in different ways, depending on how much work you want to do in one go. You could do it all at once, but it may be better to take it a bit at a time. However you choose to use this programme, it'll improve your confidence in facing exam questions and will give you a better understanding of the poems you're studying. You can find more information on the GCSE Bitesize website on www.bbc.co.uk/revision and in the GCSE Bitesize book. The other two programmes on English are Reading and Writing Non-Fiction and Media and Macbeth. Remember, Bitesize puts you in control of your own learning schedule. Bitesize is your size. This programme will help you answer questions on the poetry from different cultures in your AQA-A anthology. It covers 8 of the poems which you'll write about in Paper 2 of your English exam, 4 from Cluster 1 and 4 from Cluster 2. If you don't want to study all 8 of the poems, just fast forward to the ones you do want to study. The on-screen clock will keep track of where you are. In the exam, you'll be asked to compare at least 2 of the poems, and Section 3 of the programme will show you how to approach this. These poems are from the anthology section, titled Poems from Different Cultures and Traditions. So what's different or special about them? Well, what makes these poems slightly different is that all the poets are people who were born outside England. Therefore, they all have experience of living in another country. Some of them, however, have lived in the UK as well, and they all speak and write in English. What they also have in common is that they're all linked with the cultures and traditions that they've known. What do people mean when they talk about culture and tradition?
I am an African man, and everything I am is a product of Africa.
That's right.
Because what I do entirely in life, the way I walk and everything, is a result of originating from Africa, and that is how I see myself. I recognise that I'm a black Briton in most people's eyes, but me as an African man, and always will be, and my children will be African in that respect.
The Sikh community, I think, in Southampton are very closely knit. I think the fact that they actually reside in a particular area suggests that obviously there's a greater bonding between them.
I feel as though I'm part of an ethnic community, which means that I have a sense of common history and a sense of common destiny with other Jews.
Culture refers to the whole pattern of an environment, its beliefs, its values, its attitudes, and its language. It's really about how and why you live your life. But however you define it, the important thing is this. If you care for these things, you feel you belong.
My parents are from Barbados. My culture is bright and wild and full of historical facts.
My culture to me is really important. To me, it expresses my status. I believe everyone belongs to a culture, no matter what kind of race.
My culture is mainly black. I mainly see black people within my culture. The music I listen to is mainly black people. So I'm always around myself in a way. I'm always hearing myself.
In Barbados, people live off the land. We celebrate with fishing, singing, and really getting down in the sunshine. But most of all, we like carnival, which over there is called crop over.
Culture, then, is a way of life and a way of thinking about the world, which is characteristic of a particular group. It's what makes this group distinct in obvious things or ways like food, dress, or even hairstyle. Cultural differences also include less visible things like values, beliefs, and attitudes. All of these things can help define a person's sense of the culture they belong to. Traditions refer to those customs, habits, rituals, and history which, if you care for them, make you feel you belong to the past as well as the present.
For the Irish community, St Patrick's Day isn't just an opportunity to celebrate an historic culture. They realise their cultural traditions are an important way of passing on the Irish identity to future generations.
My parents were Irish, and I was always surrounded by Irish culture, to some extent anyway, and I appreciated it and liked it and enjoyed it. So I suppose I just wanted the same for my kids, sort of have an understanding of where they came from, or where my parents came from, their grandparents and their father, you know.
The tradition of my culture is like a carnival. Bright, cheerful, lots of food, drinking and dancing.
Within both my cultures, a traditional reception is held after the wedding, where traditional food is eaten and there's traditional music and dance, and people break plates as a source of entertainment.
Often, traditions are positive features of a culture because they bond people together in a community and strengthen the culture. But sometimes they can be seen negatively as features which get in the way of progress or get in the way of how a new generation wants to live.
My name is Abuko. I'm Muslim and I'm originally from Somalia. I think my culture is a bit harsh on women, which I think is a bit unfair. But I respect my culture because it gives me some kind of security of who I am. Every Saturday, all my family get together and read the Holy Quran and tell each other problems if we have any.
The kind of music here is different to the one in Mauritius, so I usually listen to my music from England, obviously. And like my granddad saying, what kind of music you're listening to, you should be more in touch with your natural culture instead of here. But I say to myself, like, how can I've lived in England most of my life, so how can I just get in touch with my natural culture? And they just want me to act different, but I can't do that.
Because I am young and I'm a teen, I'm very much involved in youth culture, music, fashion, and it's different to my parents' culture because they're more strict in their views because they've been brought up that way. England's much more liberal than I'd say Vietnam is or China. So I feel more comfortable with youth culture and the culture that is around me because it's multicultural in England.
It's possible to grow up in a culture that you dislike and you want to get away from, so culture can feel alienating as well as embracing. It's also possible to be equally fond of two different cultures, so people can be part of more than one culture and feel pulled in different directions by them. So, for most people, cultures and traditions tend to be a pick and mix. People choose what they want from different cultural packages as they decide what kind of identity they want for themselves.
Sometimes I'm black, and that's the issue. Sometimes I'm British, that's the issue. I actually have dual nationalities, so sometimes I'm Jamaican. Sometimes being a woman is the important aspect. And this is what often people don't recognize. You know, somebody can talk about being a man, somebody can talk about being from Cornwall, and that may be the overriding fantasy. It doesn't make them less British. So when I define myself as black, it doesn't make me any less British. It just means that that's the issue that's important in that particular discussion.
My name is MacArthur. My forefathers are from Africa. My parents were born in the Caribbean, and I was born in a small mining community in South Yorkshire. Therefore, I recognise that I have a sort of mixed bag of culture in terms of dialect and history.
I do follow a bit of my family's culture and a bit of my own sort of, because, like, for example, my own brothers, they're very different from each other, and my sister and myself, like, we're all very different, so it's not completely imposed upon me, otherwise we'd all follow the same thing and be very similar, but that's why I think I've chosen my own sort of path.
I can always identify with other cultures, and it helps build my identity, because I'm not only a Chinese, Vietnamese girl, I'm also partly English, and because of the effect of my friends on me, I'm also part of them and their cultures. So I'm not confined to one culture to define my identity.
Identity is how we see ourselves. It's made up of elements of the culture and traditions that we've grown up with. It's also shaped by the choices that we make for ourselves. Here are some of the things that may be part of a person's chosen identity. The way you dress, what particular words and phrases you use, your choice of music, the football team you support, or even the religion you follow.
I don't think I'm any different to other British people who have grown up here, who live here, who are British. And in that way, I don't think anybody's done me a favour by allowing me to be here. I think I have a lot to give to Britain, and I think Britain has a lot to take from me. And in that way, it's nothing to do with obligations and favours.
Diversity is good as we can get to mix with other cultures. If we didn't, then we'd basically learn what was given to us in colleges and schools.
My name is Michelle Sakim. I come from Liverpool. I grew up in an Irish and West Indian background, so I cannot label myself with one culture. I consider myself as multicultural.
Look, by saying that every human being is unique, you're saying that we are sharing something, aren't we? We're sharing a sameness in that we are all not the same. And it sounds crazy, but it's true.
Identity, then, is one individual's unique personal mixture of elements from various cultures. These poems in your anthology will make you think about cultures and traditions and how these have shaped the identities of the poets. They'll also make you think about the cultures and traditions that are part of your identity, whether you've chosen them or not. Let's move on to the section on understanding the poems. Now that you've become familiar with the meaning of culture and tradition, you need to become familiar with the exam so that your answer does what it needs to get most marks. Firstly, there's no standard right answer to a question on poetry. There are some things you can say with certainty, such as what the poem's about, how many lines or stanzas it has, whether it rhymes, for example. These are facts. There are other things that you can say with less certainty, but they'll count for more in the exam, as long as you can explain why you're saying them. For example, you can say something about the poet's feelings, attitudes, or purposes. These may not be stated in the poem, but you will gain marks for understanding feelings and purposes, as long as you give quotations that support your comment and explain how they show feeling or purpose. There are also things you can say with some certainty about your own response to the poems. After all, the responses are your own. You should be able to make them clear. Your personal response may include your understanding of the ideas and feelings in the poem, your reactions to the way it's been written, and how the poem affects you emotionally. The examiner doesn't have to agree with all that you say, but they will be looking for how you support your comments with detailed evidence from the words the poet has used. So there are 4 main aspects to an answer on poetry in the exam: what it says, how it says it, how you respond to it, and how it compares with other poems. The examiners will be looking for these features when they read your answers. If you're looking for a grade C, you've got to show some understanding of the feelings, attitudes, and ideas in the poem. Comment on how the writer has used language, and remember to use detail from the text to support what you're saying. And finally, you'll have to be able to refer to more than one poem in your answer. If you're more ambitious and you want to get an A grade, you'll have to show the examiner that you have a deeper understanding of the poems. You'll have to show that you have the ability to put yourself in the poet's place and really see things from their point of view. You'd have to be able to talk in detail about a variety of the writer's techniques and explain the purpose and effect of those details, and to be able to find similarities and differences between the poems. You can use this approach to read any of the poems in the anthology, whether they're covered in this programme or not. Now we're ready to look at the poems in detail. You can find the poems you're studying by fast-forwarding the tape. Look out for each poem's full-screen title, like this one, called Blessing by Imtiaz Dhaka. Imtiaz Dhaka's poem, Blessing, is set in Dharavi, a shantytown outside Bombay. Listen carefully to the images presented in this poem. What picture do they give you of life in Bombay, or Mumbai as it's now called?
The skin cracks like a pod. There never is enough water. Imagine the drip of it, the small splash echo in a tin mug, the voice of a kindly God. Sometimes the sudden rush of fortune. The municipal pipe bursts, silver crashes to the ground, and the flow has found a roar of tongues. From the huts, a congregation. Every man, woman, child for streets around butts in with pots, brass, copper, aluminium, plastic buckets, frantic hands, and naked children screaming in the liquid sun. Their highlights polished to perfection, flashing light as the blessing sings over their small bones.
Blessing is about a municipal pipe bursting in a very hot place and how everybody is excited about the flow of water. The way the people celebrated the unexpected fountain of water made the poet think they treated it as a precious gift, an act of God. Why is the water given such respect in this poem?
Before I started work on the poem called The Blessing, I'd done a lot of work in the area, which was the slum area. It is actually the largest slum in Asia, where many migrant workers come. And I was working on a project with UNICEF with a small child who has leprosy. To work with her, I had to be in there every day for about 6 months. It was strange because you'd be sitting there in the absolute dry heat, and there would be a child cleaning a pot with ash instead of water because the ash was more easily available and it's used to clean as much as water is. And she just didn't have access to enough water. And then you'd see either a water tanker come along or a municipal pipe would burst, as it does in the poem. And this is something that I've seen. The moment the water arrived, everything changed. There was so much excitement. The smell of the earth changes. Children are suddenly out on the streets with their clothes off, dancing in puddles and splashing and jumping in the water and somersaulting. Everything changes. It's like, I suppose in some ways, the way it is in England when the sun comes out. Everyone suddenly smiles. It's the same with water here. When it rains or when a pipe bursts, when that great gift of water arrives, people's lives change. And that's when you begin to see a face of God. To me, that's a face of God.
Imtiaz Dhaka wrote this poem after seeing an incident in a poor area. Blessing is set in a slum area on the outskirts of Bombay in India. It's not an official living area, and there's often a shortage of water. Sometimes it can be extremely dry and hot, so when water arrives, it's very welcome. The people in the poem felt pleased that something essential to life, but not easy to come by, had arrived free. They felt that this unexpected bonus was a kind of blessing, and they celebrated it with joy and gratitude, aware that it was unlikely to last. Their attitude was one of making the most of what fate gives you. Imtiaz Dhaka's attitude is that in poor parts of the world, simple things that may be taken for granted in the rich parts are valued more. Here, something that rich countries find common is valued as something precious. Water is also seen as precious because the poem is set in a dry country, and so she compares water to silver. Her feelings are of sympathy with these people who are so happy and grateful for something so basic. She also feels respect for the people, especially the children, polished to perfection, but recognises their vulnerability when she describes them as having small bones.
I was born in Lahore, in Pakistan, and left there when I was a year old to go to Glasgow, in Scotland, and grew up there really in a Scottish environment, but in a Pakistani household. So I would move really from one country to another the moment I stepped out of my house. I was black in Britain. I was a Scottish girl in a Pakistani household. I was a Muslim in a Calvinist school. But in a lot of ways, that wasn't a negative thing ever. It was a case of being different enough to make life interesting. Bombay took me in. I was washed up in Bombay, and Bombay made a space for me. It's a bustling, jostling, very rough, dirty, teeming place. But if you have even a little to offer, Bombay will listen to you. There was kindness here. People find niches and corners and bits of wood, pieces out of other people's lives, tin, plastic, and they put them all together and find some way of making that into a home. When people read The Blessing, I don't want them to see it just as a description of something that's very different from their lives. It's not a description of poor people. It's not a description of things happening in a slum which has nothing to do with what's happening in the rest of the world. To me, it's about the way people find maybe comfort, maybe what I call God, the goodness in themselves, the respect for themselves and a joy, which is going to be the same anywhere in the world.
Dharavi is a poor area on the outskirts of Bombay, but Imtiaz Dhaka shows its people happy in this incident because they make the most of what they have. Their feelings rise above the conditions in which they live. She creates a sense of a special occasion when writing about a minor incident on a hot day. What methods does she use to make the event seem so important? At the beginning of Blessing, the pace feels slow. The skin cracks like a pod. There's never enough water. Imagine the drip of it, the small splash, echo in a tin mug. There are more full stops in the first part of the poem. The slower pace reflects the tiredness people feel when the atmosphere is very hot and dry. But what happens to the pace of the poem when the water pipe bursts?
Sometimes, the sudden rush of fortune. The municipal pipe bursts. Silver crashes to the ground, and the flow has found a roar of tongues. From the huts, a congregation. Every man, woman, child for streets around butts in with pots, brass, copper, aluminium, plastic buckets, frantic hands, and naked children screaming in the liquid sun.
Notice how the rush of words and short phrases increases the pace of the poem to match the sense of urgency that she saw in the people. This urgency is reinforced by phrases like sudden rush and frantic hands. The use of active verbs conveys the suddenness of the event and its excitement. The municipal pipe bursts, silver crashes to the ground, every man, woman, child for streets around butts in. She lists the various containers grabbed for the purpose, pots, brass, copper, aluminium, plastic buckets. This reinforces a sense of activity and reflects the commotion and enthusiasm that the water causes. She chooses words drawn from religion to make us associate this event with something special and sacred. A small drop in a tin mug is described as the voice of a kindly god. The crowd pouring towards the burst pipe is called a congregation, and the water itself is described as a blessing, something which is usually given by a priest. In the exam, you may be asked to comment on ideas, feelings and attitudes in the poem, what the writer's expressing in the poem, or how the poem has been written. There's no right or wrong answer, and you may agree or disagree with the following. It's a poem that shows how poor people appreciate something that's very scarce and life essential. It's a poem which shows the writer's feelings of respect for the people who respond in this way to a small incident. It's a poem whose purpose it is to make the reader realise how much rich nations take for granted and how different cultures have different values. It's a poem which cleverly suggests the almost religious worship of water by using language which links the experience with a religious ceremony.
The poem Blessing also uses the analogy of religion by using terms such as congregation and God and the very title of the poem itself. So it gives a sort of spiritual connotation, if you like, to, I think, to really communicate the importance and value of water as a natural resource.
The poem Blessing speaks to me because I see how people's lives are in undeveloped countries, because to them water is like gold, whereas to me I take it for granted every day of my life.
Remember, in the exam, you'll be asked to write about 2 poems. You could compare Blessing and Hurricane Hits England. Both poems are about an unexpected event. Both of them show feelings of gratitude for the arrival of something natural. The elements feature strongly in both poems: water and the sun in Blessing, and a storm in Hurricane Hits England. However, Blessing is written by someone who's observing other people. She records their reactions and feelings. Hurricane Hits England is very personal. Grace Nichols records her own reactions and feelings. Blessing is about an event which links people with one community or culture, whereas Hurricane Hits England is about an event which links one person with 3 different communities or cultures. Pause the tape and have another look at Blessing. Then either read the poem again or fast forward the tape to Hurricane Hits England. Now it's time to move on to Island Man by Grace Nichols. Grace Nichols has written several poems about the way people who've come to England carry memories of other cultures and places in their heads. She says Island Man is written for a Caribbean island man in London who still wakes up to the sound of the sea.
Morning, an island man wakes up to the sound of blue surf in his head, the steady breaking and woman, while the seabirds and fishermen pushing out at sea, the sun surfacing defiantly. From the east of his small emerald island, he always comes back groggily, groggily. Back to sands of a grey metallic soar, to surge of wheels, to dull north circular roar, muffling, muffling his crumpled pillow waves Island man heaves himself. Another London day.
The poem is about waking up in London and the first impression of a new day. Whatever the sounds that meet this man, inside his head, they're the sounds of a faraway island. It's a poem which suggests either that we hold on to fond memories, or that memories are so strong they come back, whatever we do.
I've got quite a few poems that link Britain and the Caribbean. For example, Island Man, that was inspired because when I first moved to England, I lived in Neasden, which is quite near the North Circular Road. And that poem, Island Man, came because one morning I myself woke up and the kind of swoosh of the traffic, the big, industrial lorries going by on the North Circular, that swoosh reminded me of the sound of the sea back home. And so the idea for the poem came from that, of having this island man wake up and thinking he's back in the Caribbean. In actual fact, he's very much in London.
In Island Man, the feelings in the first part of the poem are pleasurable ones, of an environment which is dominated by the light and colours and sound of a distant Caribbean island. The feelings change later in the poem as he wakes up to the real world of noisy London traffic around him. The attitude at the end of the poem is mixed. It seems finely balanced. He may feel sad, but he also seems to reluctantly accept that London life has just got to carry on. Grace Nichols presents the waking dream of the far-off island as something attractive compared to the reality. She's suggesting that the memory of the Caribbean is a powerful help in surviving the daily, dreary environment of traffic-clogged London. She understands what a wrench it is for people to get used to city life when they've been used to a beautiful tropical setting. She's commenting on belonging to two different places and about the way we carry other parts of our lives in our heads.
There's an inner need in me to recreate and celebrate all that is mine. And that means, the Caribbean and British culture. Because people love to put you into boxes, and at times they almost want you to make a choice. Like whether, for example, you should write in just Creole as a writer, whether you should use standard English, things like that. They try to box you in your identity. But it's important for me to embrace both, all the different strands. I mean, I suppose I am a writer across two worlds. I just can't forget my Caribbean culture and past. So there's this constant interaction between the two worlds, Britain and the Caribbean. I have two citizenships, both British and Guyanese, so there's duality there.
The language used to describe the distant island emphasises the natural features of the island and its beauty. The seabirds are wild, the surf is blue, and the island is emerald, suggesting rich vegetation. The colours are vivid. Grace Nichols also uses contrast in details of sound and sight to emphasise the difference between the imagined place and the reality of London. In the Caribbean, we get natural images, the sound of the blue surf, the sun rising defiantly east of his small emerald isle. In London, the features are man-made, not natural, the colour's grey, and the noises are raw, suggesting something angry. Grace Nichols marks the turning point between the Caribbean and London settings by using the words groggily, groggily. This suggests being half awake and a bit confused, so that the real London setting emerges gradually. Like groggily, groggily, muffling, muffling makes things seem blurred, and they suggest how things seem when we're waking up and half asleep. In your exam answer, you may be asked to respond to attitudes, ideas and feelings or to the writer's purpose, or even to the way the poem has been written. You may agree or disagree with the following. The poem shows how powerful imagination or memory can be, holding and replaying images of an immigrant's background. The poem expresses the disappointment of waking up after dreaming of a beautiful place, then realising that you're not there. The poem creates a contrast between the natural environment, which he remembers in the first part of the poem, and the real industrial and commercial city environment in the second part of the poem.
The island man says to me, no matter where I go, no matter what I do, my culture will always stick with me all the time.
Everyone can relate to the poem Island Man because he is escaping from his dull life, the monotony, and going to a place where he's more welcome, back to his island. And everyone can do this when they're feeling down or don't want to do something. They can just escape. They have the freedom to do that in their minds.
The phrase small emerald island shows how important the island is to the island man. It gives an explanation of the island as being precious, because the emerald is a precious stone.
Remember, in the exam, you'll be asked to write about two poems. You could compare Island Man with Half-Caste by John Agard. Both poems are about originating from the Caribbean and deal with now being somewhere else. However, Island Man is a gentle poem about escaping in your mind from the present back to the fondly remembered island beaches. This could be in the poet's imagination or in a dream. Half-Caste is more political and argumentative, challenging attitudes about racial purity. It celebrates the Caribbean culture compared to Island Man, which celebrates its geography and climate. Pause the tape, rewind, and go over what we've just been through. Don't forget to take a break. Let's move on now to Two Scavengers in a Truck, Two Beautiful People in a Mercedes by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Ferlinghetti was known as a beat poet. The beat poets challenged the attitudes of the conventional American lifestyle and values. Lawrence Ferlinghetti has lived in San Francisco most of his life and has seen it change over the years. He feels it's become too concerned with wealth and progress, and this has created a widening gap between rich and poor in the city. Listen as Two Scavengers is recited by Mike Ferguson, a poet who was born in Nebraska, America, but who's lived most of his life in England.
At the stoplight, waiting for a light, 9 a.m. in downtown San Francisco. A bright yellow garbage truck with two garbage men in red plastic blazers. Standing on the back stoop, one on each side hanging on and looking down into an elegant open Mercedes with an elegant couple in it. The man in a hip three-piece linen suit with shoulder-length blonde hair and sunglasses. The young blonde woman so casually coiffed with a short skirt and colored stockings on the way to his architect's office. And the two scavengers, up since 4 a.m., grungy from their route, on the way home. The older of the two with gray iron hair and hunched back, looking down like some gargoyle Quasimodo. And the younger of the two, also with sunglasses and long hair, about the same age as the Mercedes driver. And both scavengers gazing down us from a great distance at the cool couple, as if they were watching some odorless TV ad in which everything is always possible. And the very red light for an instant, holding all four close together, as if anything at all were possible between them, across that small gulf in the high seas of this democracy.
He sees the contrasts in San Francisco as typical of the contrasts in America as a whole. In the poem, he describes people who represent the opposite extremes of life in a thriving modern city in the most powerful nation on earth. The poem's a snapshot of two vehicles standing at a set of traffic lights in San Francisco, one a Mercedes and the other a garbage truck. Even in this moment of being close to each other, the poem shows that the divisions between the people are great. Despite being in a society which prides itself on being democratic, and rich in opportunity like the USA. He's commenting on the divisions in American society.
Ferlinghetti is one of the great beat poets, writing in America along the West Coast, 1950s, early 60s. He's a very amusing poet. He does tackle issues, but it's often satirical, so there's a serious side, but they're usually quite amusing. He actually once defended himself for being called committed, as if beat poets couldn't tackle issues. But I think he struck that balance between, as I say, being too serious or just being too silly about things.
The attitude of the couple in the Mercedes is confident, relaxed, feeling good about themselves and their appearance. The attitude of the scavengers is less clear, but they look at the couple in the Mercedes as if there's a great distance between them. They see them as different and separate. The attitude of Ferlinghetti is that despite the promises of advertising and opportunity, there are divisions of extreme wealth and status, even within a wealthy, democratic society. Ferlinghetti presents the wealthy, successful couple in the Mercedes as people who care about their looks and belongings and their clothes. He feels that they care too much about these things.
I do like the free verse form of this poem, the way the lines dance across the page. I think here for me it's catching snapshots, all the different views as we hear the two scavengers talking about the people in the Mercedes. And I like the closing lines as well, the way the three lines are paced across the small gulf in the high seas of this democracy. I like the pauses there. And I think it forces you to think about perhaps the two endings of this poem. You could see it negatively where he's criticizing how you can have rich and poor in this democracy. But I think equally there's a very positive view that, yeah, in this democracy you can have rich and poor, and the poor can aspire to be rich, or maybe they don't really care that they're observing the rich and they're happy to be who they are.
One of the main devices that Ferlinghetti uses in this poem is contrast. Both sets of people are travelling on the city highway, but one pair is in an expensive sports car. The other is hanging onto the back of a rubbish wagon. One pair's on its way to work at 9 a.m. at an architect's office. The other has already been at work for 5 hours. One pair's well dressed. The others are dirty, so their clothes are contrasted. Ferlinghetti uses contrasting words, elegant with grungy. Hip three-piece linen suit and casually coiffed are contrasted with some gargoyle Quasimodo. Despite the appearance of elegance and smartness, the poet shows how unreal this couple are to the scavengers when he compares them to an odourless TV ad. The whole poem's a bit like a snapshot, a freeze frame of a moment, giving us a chance to look at it in detail. It's strongly pictorial. Ferlinghetti makes us see the little scene he's describing. The poem ends with an image of democracy as an ocean. Ocean is a word which suggests open space for all to travel on and free choice of where to go. This is what many Americans believe their country offers. Ferlinghetti, though, refers to a gulf in that ocean. A gulf is a small enclosed area, partially sealed off from the open sea. It's also a space between two distant parts. It signifies the space between the two couples because there's a separation between them created by unequal wealth. You can comment on the effect of this metaphor when you write about the poet's attitudes and ideas, as well as when you comment on how the poem is written. In your exam answer, you may be asked to respond to attitudes, ideas and feelings, or to the writer's purpose, or even to the way the poem has been written. You may agree or disagree with the following. Ferlinghetti has seen that in even the most democratic of countries, there are divisions between people in wealth, work and status. He's either angry about these differences, or he just accepts them as inevitable, or maybe even feels amused by them. The poem makes the reader aware that there are gulfs between people. even though we think we have equal opportunities in life. Ferlinghetti uses a snapshot technique, freezing a moment of action so that we can look at it more closely.
The bit in the poem where the Mercedes and the truck are stopped by the red light demonstrates the equality. Even though on closer inspection they are not equal, to the traffic light they are both equal.
Ferlinghetti is making a political statement. He says the small gulf of democracy, there should be democracy, but there isn't. There's no equality. You live in one city, but you've got the working class, the lower class, the higher class people, and it's all present in this poem.
Remember, in the exam, you'll be asked to compare and contrast two poems. You could compare this poem with Nothing's Changed. Both poems are about inequality and divisions between people. Both poems are set in an identifiable city, San Francisco and Cape Town. However, Ferlinghetti writes as an observer and Africa writes as someone who's unequal. Ferlinghetti records what he sees, but Africa wants to attack what he sees. His poem is more personal, as well as more bitter and angry. Pause the tape, rewind, and go over what we've just been through. And don't forget to take a break. The next poem we're going to revise is Nothing's Changed by Tatamkula Africa. Tatamkula Africa used to live in Cape Town, South Africa, in an area called District 6. The people who lived there were blacks and other non-whites, who at that time were called coloured. In the 1960s, it was declared a white-only area, and the government evacuated the people who'd been living there for some time. The poet wrote Nothing's Changed after a visit back many years later.
Small, round, hard stones click under my heels. Seeding grasses thrust bearded seeds into trouser cuffs. Cans trodden on crunch in tall, purple-flowering, amiable weeds. District 6. No board says it is, but my feet know, and my hands, and the skin about my bones, and the soft labouring of my lungs, and the hot, white, inwards turning anger of my eyes. Brash with gloss, name flaring like a flag, it squats in the grass and weeds, incipient Port Jackson trees. New upmarket haute cuisine, guard at the gatepost, whites only in. No sign says it is, but we know where we belong. I press my nose to the clear panes, know before I see them. There will be crushed ice, white glass, linen falls, a single rose. Down the road, a working man's cafe sells bunny chows. Take it with you, eat it at a plastic table's top. Wipe your fingers on your jeans, spit a little on the floor. It's in the bone. I back from the glass, boy again, leaving small, mean O of small, mean mouth. Hands burn for a stone, a bomb to shiver down the glass. Nothing's changed.
Up until recent times, South Africa had an apartheid law, which meant that black and other non-white people weren't allowed to mix with white people or use the same facilities. If an area was designated to be for whites only, it meant that no other racial group was permitted to live there. Tatamkula Africa was bitter about this situation and spent much of his life fighting apartheid as a member of Nelson Mandela's outlawed ANC party. He had fond memories of the time he spent in District 6.
When I first came to stay in District 6 in the early 60s, it seemed to me like Cairo or Alexandria had a real Egyptian feel about it, particularly Hanover Street, which was the main street in District 6. I felt at home. For the first time in my life, I felt entirely at home. There were many faiths, there were Hindus as well. It was a polyglot society. I say the only element that was missing was the white element, which kept to itself. And then it was eventually declared by the apartheid government to be for whites only. And I was extremely bitter about that.
Nothing's Changed is autobiographical. It's about a time when Tatamkula Africa returned to District 6, by now a wasteland. When Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990, people thought that things would change for the better in South Africa. But the title, Nothing's Changed, suggests that Tatamkula Africa thinks the attitude to race has remained the same. The white wealth and culture continue to dominate, and the barriers still exist, although now they're much more subtle. We can tell from his interview that Tatamkula Africa feels fondness and nostalgia for the old District 6. The poem shows that he feels angry and bitter that District 6 was pulled down and replaced by modern buildings that were not for the locals. He felt cheated by a system that had repealed the apartheid laws but was creating a new apartheid in its place. As an adult, he remembered some of the feelings he had known as a child, pressing his nose against the window to look into a place he cannot enter. I, back from the glass, boy again, leaving small mean O of small mean mouth. He resents the social divisions that still exist after apartheid. His attitude is hatred of the system and a wish to destroy it. Hands burn for a stone, a bomb, to shiver down the glass. Nothing's changed.
Nothing's Changed was written sometime in 1991. Well, it's autobiographical insofar that it did concern my own personal life. Naturally, it was an event that I lived through, that I experienced. And it refers to real places. There was that new building, that new structure, and there was the old cafe, and there was the Agard, and there were the Port Jackson trees and all these other things the poem mentions. I was no longer living in the old District 6 at the time because it was already completely trashed. I was living in a warmer estate which adjoins it, and I used to go to work in a roundabout way through the city because passing through District 6 used to intensely sadden me. It still does intensely sadden me even when I pass through today. But then one morning I decided, well, I would walk through the old district again, and the poem tells you what I saw. Nothing's Changed is actually almost wholly referring through the seen to the unseen, and to the unseen in my life, in other words, the intense inward anger. If you refer to the first stanza of that poem, you'll find that it catalogues a whole series of small objects, but all of them are resisting my passing over them, the way the District 6 is resisting the incursion of the alien. The fourth stanza, the last line, I speak of a single rose. Now that is very definitely the seen and the unseen, because behind the single rose lies much more. There lies that sense of rage at cruel, conscienceless affluence being practiced in the midst of desperate poverty.
Tatamkula Africa talks about the techniques he used in the writing of the poem. To get good marks in the exam, you'll have to show that you understand and can analyse a variety of the writer's techniques. Tatamkula Africa uses contrast in the poem to show the difference between what's left of District 6 and what's come to replace it. The poem begins with details of hard stones, grass seeds and tall weeds, suggesting neglect and disorder. This is contrasted by the upmarket, whites-only, haute cuisine restaurant, surrounded by neat, newly planted Port Jackson trees and the crushed ice, linen and rose visible behind the plate glass. These details become symbolic of the differences between the two cultures. His feelings for District 6 are conveyed by his choice of words. Although the scene at the beginning of the poem suggests neglect and wildness, he describes the weeds as amiable. He's showing his feelings of affection for simple, ordinary things when he says, "Wipe your fingers on your jeans," or talks about eating bunny chows at a cheap plastic table. This also contrasts sharply the pleasure of the simple with the expensive, exclusive restaurant which has a guard at the door. The differences in his descriptions of the expensive, exclusive restaurant and the working man's cafe highlight how unequal the society still is. The anger the poet feels is summed up by the use of physical sensation at the end of the poem. Hands burn for a stone, a bomb, to shiver down the glass. Nothing's changed. To understand Tatumkula Africa's anger, we only need to look at his background.
My full names are Tatumkula Ismail Afrika. Afrika is pronounced in the Afrikaans way. And it was my Mkhonto Sizwe code name. And then when the struggle was over and Nelson Mandela was released from prison, I wanted it to become my official name. So that is my name, and it means everything to me because I think it sums up the entirety of my life's experience. I mean, that is how I, you could say, ended my life. It's not quite over yet, but it's damn near over it as I stand here. So up to this point in time, I think it encapsulates my entire life. I've always been on the side of the underdog. I'm not a terribly kindly person, at least I don't think so. But I can pity somebody who's suffering and who's being downtrodden. I can intensely pity such a person. So when the English were in charge in South Africa and the Afrikaners were having a pretty tough time under them, I championed the Afrikaner. And then of course things switched around. Then the Nationalist Party won the elections and they began to tread on the English. Then I went over and I supported the English against the Afrikaner. Then the two of them, the Afrikaners and the English, they started to trample on the colours. So then I championed my own group. And then the coloureds, they began to help the top two to trample on the blacks because our coloured people, I must confess, can be extremely racist when they feel like it. Some of them, at any rate. And then I went all the way up. I nearly shut down. And then to this day, I champion the cause of the blacks, who after all are the majority race in the new South Africa. Every human creature is unique. Not one of us is like the other. But that doesn't mean that we must hate each other, that we must drift away from each other, that we must separate from each other. Look, by saying that every human being is unique, you are saying that we are sharing something, aren't we? We are sharing a sameness in that we are all not the same. And it sounds crazy, but it's true. Instead of us driving us away from each other, curiosity should drive us towards each other to find out why you are unique and why I am unique. So it should be a concept that binds us and engenders unity amongst human beings, not hostility.
In the exam, you may be asked to comment on ideas, feelings and attitudes in the poem, what the writer's expressing, or how the poem's been written. There's no right or wrong answer, and you may agree or disagree with the following. The poem shows that a shabby environment like District 6 can have its own culture and be precious to those who live in it. The writer shows a mixture of feelings, such as nostalgia and bitterness, but the stronger feeling is anger at injustice. Nothing's Changed is a poem which shows that injustice can exist in a society even when unjust laws have been removed. The poem uses contrasting details of environment to symbolise the difference between the modern, exclusive development and the culture it's replaced.
Nothing's Changed really hits me, and because I'm very passionate about the issue of racism. It's one thing I absolutely hate.
In Nothing's Changed, my favourite line is, "We know where we belong," because it shows how people feel in a place like South Africa, where different races have to live separately.
Remember, you'll be asked to write about 2 poems in your exam. Although it's not covered in this programme, you could compare Nothing's Changed with Not My Business by Ni Osundare. Both poems are political, making a strong statement about injustice in society. Nothing's Changed is about racial injustice, but Not My Business is about political injustice. Nothing's Changed is angry because of what the writer has experienced, whereas Not My Business is a warning of what readers may experience if they turn a blind eye to injustice. Pause the tape, rewind, and go over what we've just been through before moving on. And don't forget to take a break. Now let's turn to Half-Caste by John Agard. John Agard is a popular performance poet who makes his audience laugh and think. Half-Caste gives an amusing view of attitudes to culture and raises some serious issues about social attitudes.
Excuse me standing on one leg. I'm half-caste. Explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. You mean when Picasso mixed red and green is a half-caste canvas? Explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. You mean when light and shadow mix in the sky is a half-caste weather? Well, in that case, England weather nearly always half-caste. In fact, some of them cloud half-caste till them overcast, so spiteful them don't want the sun pass harass. Explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. You mean when Tchaikovsky sit down at that piano and mix a black key with a white key is a half-caste symphony. Explain yourself what you mean. I'm listening to you with the keen half of my ear. I'm looking at you with the keen half of my eye. And when I'm introduced to you, I'm sure you'll understand why I offer you half a hand. And when I sleep at night, I close half an eye. Consequently, I dream half a dream. And when moon begin to glow, I half-caste human being, cast half a shadow. But you must come back tomorrow with the whole of your eye, and the whole of your ear, and the whole of your mind, and I will tell you the other half of my story.
In this poem, John Agard is expressing his pleasure in his mixed racial background and identity, using language that's part of his Caribbean culture. You may have picked up from the tone of his voice and the way he looks at the camera that he's presenting an argument, that he's mocking something, and that he's challenging his audience or the reader. While Agard himself is of mixed background and so could be called a half-caste, the whole idea behind his poem is that the term actually doesn't make sense. Let's take a closer look at the poem. The poem explores what lies behind an innocent-sounding expression like half-caste. Agard is attacking people who hold false views about racial purity. He's showing how language can be used to reinforce racist thinking. He uses lots of examples of mixtures which show richness.
I am glad that I came here in my late 20s because my Caribbean consciousness was formed. The folkloric roots of the Caribbean had already been embedded in my psyche.
In the case of half-caste, there were a number of things going through my mind.
Half-caste, half-blood, half-breed, half. A lot of that, one, comes out of a fact that purity has been subverted. People feel comfortable with purity, in inverted commas. And I think that should be seen not as something threatening, but as something enriching, not as something to be paranoid and agonizing about, but something to actually tap into.
From the poem, we can see that John Agard is attacking the idea that being half-caste is inferior to being full-caste. He ridicules the view that things are better if they are pure and not mixed. He's mocking the idea that purity is better than variety. He himself is of mixed race and is proud of his origins and background. The term half-caste offends him. It implies that being of mixed culture is a weakening of identity. In his opinion, a mixed cultural identity is an enriched identity. Explaining the attitudes and feelings in the poem is an important part of your answer in the exam. So is explaining the poet's purpose and method. From the start of the poem, John Agard's purpose is to make us laugh at ridiculous behaviour. When he stands on one leg, it looks silly, but he's making us realise that the expression half-caste is just as silly. His method is to use humour to get across his point.
Humor can be seen as a bridge. It breaks down boundaries, it topples our self-important ego, it connects with people, and because it engages and entertains, it can ultimately enlighten. When you think of Archimedes discovering Archimedes' principle in his bathtub, you can't get much more comical than that.
Making the reader see that something is ridiculous is a powerful technique. But it's not the only technique that Agard uses. In his poem, he also uses examples of famous works of art where quality is a result of mixture.
Explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. You mean when Picasso mixed red and green is a half-caste canvas. Explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. You mean when light and shadow mix in the sky is a half-caste weather. Explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. You mean when Tchaikovsky sit down at the piano and mix a black key with a white key is a half-caste symphony.
By using examples of painting, music and the weather, Agard is showing that in art and in nature, mixture is positive. In the same way, being of mixed culture should be seen as positive and not second-rate. Agard also chooses these things because they show how that mixture leads to quality in white European art and culture, not just in ethnic mixtures. Agard emphasises this by writing the poem using Caribbean dialect and grammatical forms. The poem is also not written in standard English, which helps Agard reinforce his point that there's no such thing as a standard identity, a standard culture, or a standard way of expressing ideas and feelings. All this means that he's trying to teach a lesson about attitudes and values. What's clever about the poem is the way he does it. He starts by putting the reader at ease, by seeming to be apologetic. Excuse me, standing on one leg, I'm half-caste. But it soon becomes clear that this is just a way of making the reader feel comfortable before beginning to challenge ideas and attitudes. The repeated use of explain yourself not only reinforces his dislike for the term half-caste, it also makes the reader feel personally involved in a conversation with Agard. He's trying to prompt a reaction from the reader. Explain yourself. Why you mean when you say half-caste. In the exam, you may be asked to comment on ideas, feelings and attitudes in the poem, what the writer's expressing in the poem, or how the poem has been written. Remember, there's no right or wrong answer, and you might agree or disagree with the following. John Agard attacks the idea that cultural purity is a good thing. His idea is that it's better to have more than one culture. He's offended by the phrase half-caste and is proud of his own mixed background. The poet attacks those who unthinkingly use the term half-caste and challenges the reader to see that it doesn't make sense. John Agard deliberately uses the language of his Caribbean roots to display his pride in his origins and uses non-standard English to emphasise that variety is better.
I like the poem Half-Caste because it's got a lot of attitude. This poem's not going to let anybody get the better of him.
I found the poem uplifting because it showed me that when people look down on my culture, they were coming from a place of fear or ignorance and that they didn't understand my culture. And so I feel stronger and more proud to be what I am. And I realise that it's their problem and not mine.
In the exam, you'll be asked to write about 2 poems, so it's important to make links between Half-Caste and another of the poems from the anthology. You could compare Half-Caste with Search for My Tongue, because both of them directly deal with identity and language. However, Half-Caste is more about being active in using a cultural tongue, whereas Search for My Tongue is about how the mother tongue survives, even if neglected. You can also compare it with Moniza Alvi's Presents from My Aunts in Pakistan. This too shows a writer exploring links between cultures, but Moniza Alvi is drawn more to the English part of her culture, whereas John Agard is drawn more to his Caribbean part. Pause the tape, rewind, and go over what we've just been through before moving on. And don't forget to take a break. Time now to look at Search for My Tongue by Sujata Butt. Search for My Tongue is a poem in which Sujata Butt reflects on the links between cultures, languages, and herself.
This is a short extract from a long poem called Search for My Tongue. You ask me what I mean by saying I have lost my tongue. I ask you, what would you do if you had 2 tongues in your mouth and lost the first one, the mother tongue?
I started to write Search for My Tongue when I realized that that there was nothing I had written which reflected some of my secret and, to me, intimate thought patterns.
But overnight, while I dream, mane hatu ke akhi jeeb, akhi bhasha, me thunki nakhi che.
There are many times when I think in English and in Gujarati simultaneously, and the 2 vocabularies and grammars merge in a way that they can't merge in conversation. And I wanted to write like that.
Fulni jem, mari bhasha, mari jeeb, modha ma khile che.
Sometimes something that begins in either language continues in the next without repetition. So, for example, in English, I have the bud opens. And in Gujarati, I continue with the image and turn it into a flower and a fruit, but don't mention the word bud in Gujarati.
Search for My Tongue is a poem written in 2 languages, English and Gujarati. These are the languages of the 2 cultures that have given Sujata Butt her identity. But she's grown up using English and not Gujarati. In the poem, she wonders if this means that she's lost her mother tongue, Gujarati, and lost the part of her identity that came from that mother tongue and the culture that it belongs to. However, the mother tongue comes back to her in her dreams, and the poem expresses the idea that language is like a plant. Its roots, even when neglected or hidden, can still grow and blossom. This suggests that even if we move away from our original culture, some of it will stay with us. Sujata Butt expresses a mixture of feelings in this poem. She starts by feeling sorry that at the beginning she may have lost her mother tongue because she hasn't used it for so long. She feels that the loss of her mother tongue is a sign of losing contact with her cultural roots. However, the poem ends with a feeling of relief that her mother tongue comes back to her in her dreams.
I was born in India, in Ahmedabad, and I grew up there, as well as in Pune, a city near Bombay. And then later, when I was 12, my parents decided to move to the United States. And my brother and I, of course, joined them. And then much later, when I was at university, I met someone from Germany who is now my husband and has been for many years now. And that briefly is how I ended up in Bremen.
How does Sujata Butt convey her feelings and ideas in this poem? She uses 3 devices to show how different cultures can be blended in one person: visual, verbal, and sound devices. Look at the poem on the page. The 2 different kinds of script stand out immediately: Gujarati and English. Although they look different, both languages say the same things. It shows that being bilingual doesn't mean having a split personality or thinking in 2 different ways. She's the same person with the same feelings in either language. The effect is to connect her to both parts of her cultural background. Sujata Butt's choice of words is important in conveying her ideas and feelings. When she describes her neglected Gujarati tongue, she uses words connected with living, growing things. The images used suggest that culture stays with you. It's a natural, living thing. You can see this in the imagery of shoot and bud and blossom. All of these words link language with plants and make us think of it as something alive, not dead. Another device she uses to make us see that language is a living thing is something called personification. She describes her mother tongue as if it's a person with a mind and a will of its own. It pushes the other tongue aside, and it grows back. Finally, she allows an English reader to become a little more familiar with the Gujarati script by showing how it should be pronounced. This use of a phonetic version is a method of making the language less alien, showing that the differences between languages and cultures can be bridged.
Well, I've started to feel that my identity is something that's always changing, and it's not frozen in time or place. And so I started to imagine it as something consisting of layers. For example, I feel that emotionally I'm very Indian, while intellectually I'm quite Western and influenced by Western culture.
In the exam, you may be asked to comment on ideas, feelings and attitudes in the poem, what the writer is expressing in the poem, or how the poem has been written. There's no right or wrong answer, and you might agree or disagree with the following. It's a poem which shows how our mother tongue or native language stays with us, even if we don't use it. It's a poem which expresses the writer's relief and pleasure that she hasn't lost touch with her roots and can express herself in the language of two cultures. It's a poem written to make the reader understand the importance of language as part of identity. It cleverly mixes languages to show how identity can be a result of mixed cultures and uses imagery to suggest that language is not something that dies.
I like the way the poet uses the word tongue. She uses it to mean her language and the tongue in her mouth.
I agree with the poet. It's not good to lose your mother tongue because I too speak two different languages, and if I never had my mother tongue, I wouldn't be able to communicate with half my family, and that's also taking part of my life away and my culture, so I don't really think it's good to lose your mother tongue.
Finally, remember that you need to write about 2 poems in the exam. So if you've written about this poem, you'll need to compare it with another poem from the Different Cultures section of your anthology. You could compare this poem with John Agard's Half-Caste. Both of them show that language is an important part of a person's identity, and that language links us to the cultural heritage it belongs to. However, the poems are different in that Agard chooses the language of one part of his cultural heritage, and Sujata Butt shows that she can express the same thoughts equally well in the languages of both cultural heritages. They're also very different in attitude and feeling. In Half-Caste, the poet is assertive and his attitude is mocking and argumentative. In Search for My Tongue, the poet is reflective and pleased to discover that her mother tongue survives. You could compare it with Presents from My Aunts. Both poems explore the writer's relationship with the two cultures that are part of them. However, Presents shows culture through the symbol of clothing, whereas Search shows it through language. Also, Presents introduces the idea that cultural pressures can be to do with peer group cultures, not just ethnic cultures. Section 3 of the programme will look at comparing and contrasting in more depth. Pause the tape, rewind, and go over what we've just been through before moving on. And don't forget to take a break. The next poem we're going to revise is Presents from My Aunts in Pakistan by Moniza Alvi. Moniza Alvi was born in Pakistan but left when she was very young and has lived in England ever since. She doesn't remember the Pakistani part of her background but knows about it from stories, pictures and gifts from her relations.
They sent me a shawl kameez, peacock blue, and another, glistening like an orange split open. Embossed slippers, gold and black, points curling. Candy-striped glass bangles snapped, drew blood. Like at school, fashions changed in Pakistan. The shalwar bottoms were broad and stiff, then narrow. My aunts chose an apple green sari, silver bordered, for my teens. I tried each satin silken top, was alien in the sitting room. I could never be as lovely as those clothes. I longed for denim and corduroy. My costume clung to me and I was aflame. I couldn't rise up out of its fire. Half English, unlike Aunt Jamila. I wanted my parents' camel skin lamp, switching it on in my bedroom, to consider the cruelty and the transformation from camel to shade. Marvel at the colours like stained glass. My mother cherished her jewellery, Indian gold, dangling, filigree. But it was stolen from our car. The presents were radiant in my wardrobe. My aunts requested cardigans from Marks and Spencer's. My shalwar kameez didn't impress the school friend who sat on my bed, asked to see my weekend clothes. But often, I admired the mirror work, tried to glimpse myself in the miniature glass circles, recall the story how the three of us sailed to England. prickly heat had me screaming on the way. I ended up in a cot in my English grandmother's dining room. Found myself alone, playing with a tin boat. I pictured my birthplace from 50s photographs. When I was older, there was conflict, a fractured land throbbing through newsprint. Sometimes I saw Lahore. My aunts in shaded rooms screamed from male visitors, sorting presents, wrapping them in tissue. Or there were beggars, sweeper girls, and I was there, of no fixed nationality, staring through fretwork at the Shalimar Gardens.
What made her want to write about those presents? Well, firstly, she wanted to write about her personal experiences. She has said that the poem is fairly autobiographical. Secondly, it's about something that lots of teenagers have experienced, presents from relations. In her case, the presents of traditional women's clothing were intended to keep her in touch with her Pakistani culture. Thirdly, the poem makes her think about her own cultural identity and where she belongs. She finds it amusing that the aunts are trying to get her to wear salwar kameez when what they want are Marks & Spencer's cardigans. Finally, it's about her mixed impressions of life in Pakistan through the presents, although she's never actually been there. Why was this memory of the presents from her aunts so important to the poet? It was important because the presents stirred up so many mixed feelings and they made her aware of some of her own attitudes. Her main attitude was, as an English teenager, that the presents weren't really part of her own life. She'd grown up used to Western clothes and customs. She feels she belongs in England and that the presents don't really fit into her life here. Her mixed feelings arose because she found the clothes exotic and attractive, but as a teenager, she wanted to keep them in her wardrobe, preferring to wear denim and corduroy. She's influenced by what her friend likes and so bows to peer pressure. So apart from different ethnic cultures, she's also influenced by her teenage peer group cultures. The poem shows how she felt pulled between her English culture and her Pakistani roots. She's confused and wonders where she belongs.
My father's Pakistani and my mother's English. When I was a few months old, we came to England and I grew up in Hatfield in Hertfordshire. I suppose I had a very anglicised upbringing, but I was always aware of the Asian side of my background. I suppose I was aware of it through relatives, friends of the family, and the stories that they told, photographs, and also the presents that they brought from Pakistan. I do think it's important to know where we come from and to understand the diversity of our own cultures and other people's as well. And I think our individuality is actually much deeper and broader than just where we happen to come from. And that does develop with us, and we can add to it as we get older. When I wrote Presents from my aunts, I hadn't actually been back to Pakistan, so all my feelings were really based on parents' stories, anecdotes, news items. When I actually went back, some things seemed very different from how I'd imagined. For example, my father seemed much more English than he'd seemed in England. And I didn't feel that I belonged in Pakistan. I felt very English myself. I'd never felt so English as when I went back to Pakistan. But I did also feel that I was revisiting an important part of me.
When you're reading the poem, remember that you're not just looking for the ideas and feelings it conveys, but also at how it uses language and how it communicates. Monisa Alvi has written the poem in standard English because English is the language she feels at home in. The poem uses clothes as a symbol of identity and belonging. Her aunts want her to keep up the Pakistani traditions, while she prefers English clothes and therefore English culture.
Clothes are really important for establishing our identity, particularly when we're growing up. When I was a teacher, I often had to tell girls off for not being in proper uniform, and I found that quite difficult because I remembered what it was like wanting to add a little bit of individuality to the school uniform, adding a personal touch. Presents from My Aunts is largely autobiographical. I did make up the bit about the friend not being impressed by my Eastern clothes. I think the idea was that the friend was really showing one side of my feelings about the presents.
Clothes are only one of the devices that Maniza Alvi uses to explore her identity. Note how she uses images to suggest her mixed feelings. A salwar kameez, peacock blue, and another glistening like an orange split open. But then she reflects on her mixed feelings about the Pakistani side of her identity as she remembers the beggars and the sweeper girls and that there was conflict. She feels distant from her Pakistani roots and may also be feeling too English to identify with a Pakistani setting. She talks of staring through the fretwork at the Shalimar Gardens, suggesting something of a barrier between herself and the scene. Although she presents the Pakistani ornaments as attractive, she also remembers a downside to them. The bangles snapped, drew blood. Perhaps they're not suited to the way the poet lives in England. Also, although she enjoyed dressing up in the satin, silken tops at home, they made her feel alien in her sitting room. It's as if wearing the clothes changes her identity and she no longer feels at home. Even the shape of the poem on the page is significant. Have a look at your anthology and notice how the shape is irregular, with lines starting at different places and all different lengths.
Perhaps the shape of the poem, the way that it's unfixed along one side, shows how the girl's feelings are also unfixed, wandering in and out, having a glimpse of one culture, thinking about another. I'm pleased that my daughter has a mixed background, and I hope that she'll be proud of this and that it will help her to understand racial and cultural issues in the future. And maybe will give her a sense of wonder at the diversity in the world.
In the exam, you may be asked to comment on ideas, feelings and attitudes in the poem, what the writer's expressing in the poem, or how the poem's been written. There's no right or wrong answer, and you might agree or disagree with the following. The poem explores the way people manage to deal with different elements in their lives by making cultural choices or having them made for them. The poem shows strong feelings of admiration for the presents, but also strong feelings that they're alien and do not fit into her life. The poem's autobiographical, and the poet wants to show that peer group culture is as important as ethnic culture when making choices. The poem makes use of subtle contrast, not just between the English and Pakistani cultures, but also between the writer's feelings as she looks at bangles, lampshades, and pictures of the Shalimar Gardens.
The camel skin lamp in Presents from My Aunt in Pakistan seems to be something traditionally Asian placed into a contrasting environment, and it's much like the narrator's position herself.
The colours and descriptions in Presents from My Aunt in Pakistan are very beautiful. You can see that she wants to identify with her Asian background. Yet the bangles snapped, drew blood, and you can see that she also wants to break away.
I can really relate to her words because I do experience it myself. I receive presents from my aunts in Vietnam, and though I think they're really beautiful and I'd love to wear them, I couldn't because of the cultural differences between England and Vietnam, and then there's also peer pressure. They'd always be passing judgment onto you.
Presents from My Aunts in Pakistan is a good poem to compare with John Agard's Half-Caste. They're similar in showing strong feelings for cultural roots. However, Agard emphasises the Caribbean side of his identity and prefers to use Caribbean dialect rather than standard English. Moniza Alvi writes the whole poem in standard English, showing that her feelings are perhaps more strongly towards the English side of her identity. Rewind and look at the clips to help you make some more comparisons. The last poem we're going to look at is Hurricane Hits England by Grace Nichols. Grace Nichols found a surprising connection between her present and her past when a hurricane hit England, where she now lives.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. At least 13 dead. Damage running into millions of pounds. The chaos on the day a storm battered southern Britain without warning. A storm with winds that ripped roofs off people's homes as they slept. That blocked roads and railways and blacked out the capital. Tonight, 1 million people are still without electricity. Who pays for the damage to your house and to your car? Britain clearing up after what the Home Secretary has described as the worst night of disaster since 1945.
Hurricanes aren't common in England, so the one that occurred in 1987 was a big shock for many people and was taken very seriously. They happen far more often in the Caribbean, so this one reminded Grace Nichols of her homeland. For example, Hurricane Hattie that she'd experienced as a child.
It took a hurricane to bring her closer to the landscape. Half the night, she lay awake, the howling ship of the wind, its gathering rage, like some dark ancestral spectre, fearful and reassuring. Talk to me, Hurukan. Talk to me, Oya. Talk to me, Shango and Hattie, my sweeping back home cousin. Tell me why you visit an English coast. What is the meaning of old tongues reaping havoc in new places? The blinding illumination, even as you short-circuit us into further darkness. What is the meaning of trees falling heavy as whales, their crusted roots, their cratered graves? Oh, why is my heart unchained? Tropical Oya of the weather, I'm aligning myself to you. I'm following the movement of your winds. I'm riding the mystery of your storm. Ah, sweet mystery, come to break the frozen lake in me, shaking the foundations of the very trees within me. Come to let me know that the earth is the earth is the earth.
This poem makes some surprising links between the poet and the culture that she comes from. The hurricane in England reminds Grace Nichols of hurricanes in the Caribbean. In her mind, the hurricane takes her from Brighton, where she lives now, to Guyana, where she was born, and then back to Africa, where her ancestors came from. Although the hurricane was violent and destructive, she found something positive in the experience, which is an unusual reaction because a hurricane is dangerous and frightening, not something you'd think could bring about any good. And it did make Grace Nichols feel fearful at first, but then she found it reassuring. How can such a violent event have this effect?
Well, Hurricane Hits England was inspired by an actual hurricane that happened in England in 1987. I remember lying in bed throughout that great storm and feeling all the, feeling the effects of the hurricane happening outside, the sound of the wind, the lightning coming through my window. It seemed as though the voices of the old gods, back in the Caribbean were in the winds, were in the Sussex winds. And it made a big kind of psychic impression on me and connection, because it seemed as though for the first time I felt very close to the English landscape in a way that I hadn't earlier, because it seemed as though, you know, the earth was one, really.
So, although she began with a feeling of fear, the main feeling in the poem is gladness that the hurricane brought together the two cultures which have shaped Grace Nichols' identity. Hurricanes are familiar in Guyana and Africa, and this hurricane made her feel as if something from these countries had come to visit her in England to remind her of the lands of her cultural roots. In Africa, hurricanes are seen as signs of supernatural force. The Yoruban people believed in the gods Oya and Shango. The hurricane made her think that these gods were present in England and reminded her of the culture and traditions of her ancestors.
Well, I've used a number of gods in that particular poem. First of all, you have Hurukan. He's the Carib god of hurricanes. And you have Oya. She is the Yoruba, African goddess of the winds. You have Shango. He's the god of thunder and lightning, even though Oya is also associated with lightning. And then you have Hati. She's just the name of a hurricane. Oya's major symbol is the mask, because it conceals her face. And because you can't see the face of the wind, you can see that immediate connection. But it's said that she's such a terrible goddess that, I mean, no one wants to see her face.
The faith of the Yoruban people was transported from Africa to the Caribbean at the time of the slave trade. Now it seems to have been transported from the Caribbean to England, following the tracks of Grace Nichols and her ancestors. When she speaks to the gods, she feels connected to the culture of her ancestors. The effect of the storm was to make her feel more at home in England, because the hurricane connected her with her cultural roots. Grace Nichols likes to feel that she's kept contact with the different cultures which have shaped her identity. She doesn't prefer one to the other, but feels equally at home in Guyana and England.
Well, I grew up in a small country village along the Atlantic coast in Guyana. Guyana was a former British colony, and so obviously that link, that colonial link, was there, because we grew up studying the works of English writers and being very familiar with English culture in a way. I grew up reading, you know, William books, Enid Blyton, and then when I was older, Jane Austen, Shakespeare, Keats, the usual fare of English writers that I expect children in England would have grown up with. So in a strange kind of way, I was already familiar with England, even before coming.
The hurricane is presented as more than a natural event. Using a word like spectre to describe it makes it seem ghost-like and supernatural. It's also described with words such as howling and rage, which implies something with feelings and intentions. This device of giving the hurricane a personality is an example of personification. The personification continues when she addresses the hurricane as you, again as if it's a person. The hurricane is personified as something supernatural with its own identity by using the names of the Yoruban gods Oya and Shango. Grace Nichols uses several metaphors in the poem that show her feelings and ideas. For example, she refers to the hurricane as having come to break the frozen lake in me, and her heart has now been unchained. Both images express something in her nature brought back to life by the violence of this natural event. The hurricane brought the Caribbean weather to the English landscape. Until then, living in England had had an effect on her that was like icing up. She refers to a frozen lake, which is something that is cold and hard and rigid, suggesting that a part of her has become cold and hard. Now, after the hurricane, she feels better about being in England because it's been touched by something Caribbean. The storm has melted something that was cold and hard in her feelings, and she's been able to reconnect to her roots and feels at home in the English landscape. She uses more metaphorical language also with reference to her heart being locked up, my heart unchained. Anything which is chained is imprisoned, but now the hurricane has set her heart free. Again, it reinforces the view that the hurricane was a positive thing. In the final statement, Grace Nichols expresses the unity of the earth. The earth is the earth is the earth. She's saying that there should not be divisions in the earth. Whether we live in England or Guyana or Africa, we should see the earth as one single entity rather than as divided and foreign. Grace Nichols' purpose in this poem is to show the reader that violent natural events can have good outcomes and that the world is our one and only world, whichever part we live in. In the exam, you may be asked to comment on ideas, feelings and attitudes in the poem, what the writer's expressing in the poem, or how the poem has been written. Remember, there's no right or wrong answer, and you might agree or disagree with the following. Grace Nichols uses the idea of different cultures being briefly united by experiencing the same weather conditions. Although frightened at first, the poet is calmed by the hurricane. She's left with a greater sense of being at home in England. She wrote the poem to show how some good may come out of violent events and to remind herself of her ancestors and their cultures. She uses violent language to express the violence of the storm and clever metaphors to show the effects it had on her.
Hurricane Hits England is a good title because it tells you exactly what the poem's about. It's a bit like a newspaper headline. It's a shock, which is exactly what a hurricane would be, especially in England.
In the first day I came to England, it was raining, which doesn't really happen in my country a lot of times. And it made me feel different from who I was before. I didn't feel at home, I felt a bit out of this world. But in the second day, when there was a bit summer and it was hot, it reminded me again of where I'm from. And even though I'm in another country, it doesn't mean nothing. I'm still the same person.
You could compare Hurricane Hits England with John Agard's Half-Caste, as both poems show an affection for the Caribbean. Grace Nichols' poem, though, is different in feelings. It's a poem of gladness and satisfaction, whereas Agard's is a poem of confrontation. You could also compare it with Presents from My Aunts in Pakistan, though it's more about the coming together of cultures than the separation of cultures. You could also compare it with Search for My Tongue, where there's a similar joy in discovering that the old cultural roots have not died, but have come back and found the poet who'd forgotten them. Pause the tape here and have another look at your copy of Hurricane Hits England. How is the hurricane described in the poem? And what does this tell you about the poet's attitude towards it? Rewind and have another look at the clips if you want to. Now let's turn to the exams themselves. In this section, we'll look at how to handle questions and then look at comparing and contrasting poems. So what are they going to ask you in your exam? You will need to write about the ideas in the poems and the use of language. But not all exam questions will be phrased in exactly the same way. And anyway, you'll never have time in 45 minutes to write everything you've learned, so you have to select. To do this, look at the key words or phrases in the questions. These could be comments on ideas and attitudes and feelings. How do particular words and phrases bring out a poet's ideas? What was the poet's intention in writing the poem, and how do you know? What's the effect of the poem on you, and why? How does the poet use words to capture sensations, such as sound, sight, smell, touch? You may be asked to comment specifically on imagery and symbolism, and form and structure, including rhyme and rhythm. Another way to gain higher marks is to remember to illustrate the points you make with quotations. You can make excellent points about any of the poets, but you'll never gain the top marks if you don't pick out quotations which illustrate what you mean. A quotation should be the point in the poem where what you're saying is shown most clearly. Remember this process: your point, quotation, comment. Point, quotation, comment. Although you can't know the precise question you'll be asked in the exam, what you can say with certainty is that you will be asked to write about 2 of the poems, either to highlight their similarities or differences, or both. One mistake that many students make is to write about the 2 poems separately and forget to make cross-references between them. Don't make this mistake. To make the most of the marks available for comparison, you need to remember the following. Comparing means show how the poems are similar, but it also means show how the poems are different. Showing the differences is called contrast, and if you compare and contrast, you'll get more marks. Plan your comparison. Think of some headings and under them write a list of points showing similarities and differences in the poems. You can use details of attitudes, ideas and feelings that come from the poem. You could talk about how the poem uses language, what the poet is saying in the poem, and its effects upon you. To show similarity between poems, there are certain words and phrases that you can use that will let the examiner see how you're making points. These are just a few of them. Can you think of others? And there are certain words and phrases that you can use to suggest differences between the poems. Here's an example of the sort of question you may be asked. In Search for My Tongue, Sujata Butt writes about her relationship with the different parts of her cultural background. Compare her poem with one other poem which explores the connections between the writer and his or her cultural background. Write about what they have to say about the poets and their cultural backgrounds, and how the poems are written. Now you need to think of a poem to link with Search for My Tongue. You could choose from one of a number of poems: Presents from My Aunts in Pakistan, Half-Caste, or Island Man. All express the writer's feelings and attitudes about different cultures and their identity. Let's say you choose Presents from My Aunts in Pakistan. The first thing to do is organise your thoughts and write down some headings. For example, feelings about their cultures. How have they written the poems? And what are the poets saying? Then list the points that show similarities between the poems under the relevant headings. Both poems are about the importance of different cultures. There's a similar attitude of wanting to be free to choose between their cultures. There's a common idea that culture is strong enough to affect us, even when we try to lose it or are far from it. The similarities in how the poems are written are that both use standard English and they both use blank verse. The two writers want the reader to see that cultural roots are an important feature of identity. Then use the same subheadings, but this time list the differences between the two poems. In Search for My Tongue, Sujata Butt shows relief and pleasure that she has not lost her mother tongue and is therefore still in touch with her roots. She identifies with both her cultures. Whereas Moniza Alvi, in Presents from My Aunts in Pakistan, is caught between her two cultures. Although she likes the Pakistani clothes that are sent to her, she feels embarrassed wearing them. They make her feel alien. There's a conflict between how she sees herself with her friends and with her cultural past. But she's amused that her Pakistani aunts want Marks and Spencer's cardigans. The differences in how the poems are written are that Search for My Tongue is a mixture of standard English and Gujarati. The poem uses strong metaphorical language to symbolise the strength of her culture. However, Presents from My Aunts is written only in standard English, and the poem uses more factual language to express her own feelings about the cultures she's describing. You should then list the different purposes that each writer had in writing the poem. For example, Sujata Butt in Search for My Tongue is celebrating the strength of language which survives even when it's neglected or rejected. She's realised that you never totally lose contact with your cultural roots because they stay part of you, whether you like it or not. However, in Presents from My Aunts in Pakistan, Moniza Alvi wants to show that people are pulled in different directions by their roots and their friendships. She feels she can choose what she wants from her roots or her friendships in order to shape her own identity. Now let's see how all this looks in practice. Here are two examples of openings to answers to a question on Search for My Tongue and Presents from My Aunts. This example makes good points about similarity. Both of these poems are about the importance of different cultures in someone's life. In Search for My Tongue, Sujata Butt explains how her mother tongue comes back to her even when she hasn't used it for a long time. This shows that parts of different cultures stay with us for a long time. In the same way, Presents from My Aunts is about the importance of cultures. Moniza Alvi explains how she likes the clothes of a Pakistani culture when they're in her bedroom, but she wouldn't wear them outside in case her friends thought they were unfashionable. This also shows how different cultures are important in everybody's life, whether it's teenage culture or ethnic culture. Notice how the sentences in the answer begin with both and in the same way, and use also to reinforce the similarity. This shows an understanding of attitudes, ideas and feelings, enough to make the examiner think it's a C grade answer. Now look at this answer, which is starting to deal with similarities and differences. Both of these poets write about their own life experiences and about the tensions caused by a feeling of belonging to different cultures. However, Sujata Butt is more at ease with her two cultures. She's glad that she will not lose her mother tongue because language has its own way of staying alive, blossoming when she's asleep and when she thought it would rot and die because she did not use it. Moniza Alvi is also writing about cultures and identity, but she shows the effects of her cultures in a different way. Notice how this answer makes clear points of similarity with both and also, and shows differences with however and but. There's effective use of detail to support the comments with references integrated into the argument. This is just the start of an answer, but it's beginning to show sympathy with the author's attitudes, ideas and feelings. It's also beginning to compare and contrast the poems very well, and so may go on to get an A grade. But remember, always back up any point you make with evidence from the poem. Now that you've seen how to write a good answer in the exam, you should do something about it. You could go back and look at two other poems on this tape, or write a timed practice answer to the question we've just done. If you do this much planning in the exam and can support your answers with well-selected, accurate quotes, then you're an A-star. Remember, the other two programmes on English are on Reading and Writing Non-Fiction and Media and Macbeth. If you haven't found it already, here's a reminder of the web address, www.bbc.co.uk/revision. You can also find more information in the GCSE Bitesize book.